right, guys, so today we're going to look at Asian history. We looked at the culture on Thursday and Friday, and today we're going to look at history. And I really debated how to do this because you could spend like a whole year on just Chinese history or Japanese history. So what I did is I picked up like 7 or 8 of the big events they consider important in their culture, and we're going to just focus on those, okay? So that way you know what's really important and really change their history. So we're going to start with China first, and you'll see the numbers are here in pink on the right-hand side of the screen. Our first one is the Opium War. This took place from 1839 to 42, and a lot of people are confused about the Opium War. They think that the Chinese were the ones selling the opium, bad guys, whatever. Truth is, in this story, the drug dealers are the British. Go figure, right? Yeah, who knew? So here's what happens. The British East India Trading Company, remember if you watch Pirates of the Caribbean, remember that trading company? Okay, they were trading all over the world, and they were getting opium from India, and they were bringing it and selling it in China. And all these people were starting to get addicted to opium. It was causing problems. And so the government outlawed the opium trade in their country. Well, Lin Zexu, the leader of China at the time, said to Queen Victoria, said, "No more opium. I want it out of my country." And the British didn't listen. They were making money on the deal. So Lin Zexu said, "We are going to blockade the ports from all British ships. No more trading with the British." They didn't like that so much, so they attacked. And as you know, the British Navy was the most powerful in the world at this time, and the Chinese could not hold them back. So eventually, they sit down to negotiate, and they had the Treaty of Nanjing that actually took place right up here, named for the city of Nanjing. And this was what they agreed upon. Number 1, they would open 5 ports to trade with the British. Number 2, the British would have low taxes on their goods. Number 3, the Chinese had to pay all the war damages for the British. And number 4, they had to give the British Hong Kong, which is down right here. Notice it doesn't say anything about the opium, does it? Because it continued. The British won the war, so they got to do what they wanted, and they just kept selling the opium. It's a very strong drug. It would be on the likes of like cocaine, maybe, something like that. It's a very strong hallucinogen. So I'm not a real expert on all that stuff, but okay. So our next event is the Taiping Rebellion from 1850 to 1864, and you guys know this one. So some of these will be review for you, but it'll be good. So remember that Hong Shuan, like putting your shoe on, that was your leader. And he had a vision from God that he was supposed to fight for control of China. And if you remember, he believed he was the brother of Jesus. Remember that weirdo? Yeah, that was him. And he was a fighter for the peasants. He fought for peasants' rights. He fought for land distribution for the poor. He fought for women's rights, which is rather unique. He wouldn't wear a queue, which you remember is a braid, so they called them the long hairs. And as a result, over 20 million people died because of this rebellion. The result, with the help of the US and the British, the government put down the Taiping Rebellion. And if you remember, one of the stipulations was they had to kill the leaders of the rebellion. So they executed all of them. You'll notice this is a picture of some Taiping prisoners. Notice they were women as well. The next major event is the 100 Days Reform. 1898, the leader was Guang Shu, and he wanted Western ways. So he wanted schools, English language, free press, he wanted Western weapons, all that stuff. And remember that we're still in China here, we're not in Japan yet. So it was 2 leaders kind of going against each other. Empress Zixi over here on the right was his aunt. And she didn't like the fact that Guangxu was leading because when he was a boy, she was in charge. So she put him in prison to stop these changes and reforms. But that doesn't end there because if you remember, this leads us into our next event, which is the Boxer Rebellion of 1899. You can imagine it's an American that starts this little shindig, right? John Hay, the U.S. Secretary of State, pushed China to trade with the United States. And they signed the open door policy. If you remember, this said that China had to trade with the world, which sounds nice on the surface, but remember that it was to protect us so that we were not blocked out of the deal. We wanted to make sure we could trade with them. We were getting spices and silks and things like that. Remember, they were called the Boxers, or the Society of Harmonious Fists, because they used shadow boxing like this, right? Yeah, to avoid the bullets, but it looked like boxing. These people hated Western influence. So the people they could target that were around them were missionaries who were trying to get people to convert to Catholicism or being a Christian. So they started traveling around the country, killing missionaries and their families. You can imagine they were the bad guys in American press, right? How much the Americans would hate them for that. Because the Western armies came in and helped, they put down the Boxer Rebellion as well. Number 5 is the Revolution of 1911. We haven't talked about this one yet. So the guy in charge in China at the time was this cute little guy right here, Henry Puyi. He's called the Child Emperor because he took over when he was just a toddler. In fact, it is a great movie. If you'll look on Amazon, there's one, I think it's called Henry Puyi, the Child Emperor. His life is really interesting. Like how they treated him because he was a king, but he was a toddler. Yeah, very cool. Well, this guy over here, Sun Yat-sen, led a rebellion and defeated Henry Puyi and his supporters with the revived China Society. And he started westernizing a few things. He wanted Western ideas, but he also knew there was only so far that they could handle it, right? They weren't ready for democracy, for example. That would have taken them too far. This leads to the fall of the Qing dynasty, which is Puyi's family line, and the start of the Republic of China, which we have today. Number 6, you'll notice, is kind of highlighted and there's purple around it. It's because although this is a Chinese event, it includes all 3 of our countries. So this one's important to all of our countries. This is the Sino-Japanese War. Took place 1894 to 1895. It was about 9 months long, a little less than a year. And it was the Qing dynasty of China against the Meiji dynasty of Japan. Remember, what were the Meiji? Opposite. The government, the Western powers in Japan, right? They were being westernized. And why are they fighting? Over Korea, right over here. So the question is why? Why do they want Korea? 3 reasons. Number 1, if you look at this map over here, okay, here's Korea, right? China's up here, and you'll see Japan is right here. Well, China and Japan were not getting along, and so they wanted it as kind of a buffer zone. So, for example, if China were going to invade Japan, they would have to either go through Korea or by it, and they could fight them up here before they got all the way to their homeland. So it was a buffer zone for war. Secondly, Korea had coal and iron ore, and this is the era where everything is run by coal. Your trains, your ships are all fed by coal. And they also wanted to force Korea to trade because Korea was basically, he had walls around him, right? Didn't want to be any part of the outside world, and they were going to force Korea outside those borders. Now, if you look at this map over here, you'll see these arrows and stuff. This is where the majority of the fighting happened. You'll see we have a lot of naval battles over in here. And then we've got a lot of line battles up here on land. Where do you see most of our battles are happening on land? I'll give you a hint. Here's the border of Korea along the Yalu River. What's north of there? China. Yep, this is Manchuria, China, right up here. So unfortunately, a lot of our civilians up there are going to get killed. They're going to get caught in the fight. And also, by the way, look at how much is happening on Taiwan as well. Taiwan, on this map, is right down here. So I have something really cool to show you. I told you this is on land and sea, and believe it or not, they actually have video footage of a sea battle from this war. I didn't even think they had video capability back then. And it doesn't even have sound, but it's really cool. I had to show this to you. Oh, shoot. Hold on. What did I do? No, I don't want to record. Okay, sorry for the technical difficulties. Moving on. So, by taking a look at this political cartoon, tell me who won. How do we know Japan won? Good. Yes, samurai are a Japanese thing. So notice we've got little tiny samurai Japan defeating huge China with its huge land and its huge population. The world was in shock. They couldn't believe a little country like Japan would defeat a huge China like that. And by the way, you saw there's a couple political cartoons on your semester test. So that's why we're practicing a little bit. Notice the Japanese were outnumbered 3-1. Didn't matter. They were better fighters. They had better technology. Casualties, the Chinese had 35,000. The Japanese had 5,000. And there were about 12,000 that died of disease as well. What's that? Yep. So our results, they decided to sit down and negotiate, but obviously China had basically been defeated, so they didn't have much say. They met at the Triple Intervention of 1895, and they agreed these things. Number one, both would leave Korea alone. Now, Japan said that as long as they would pay them money. So they did. China paid 13,000 tons of silver to Japan as reparations, which, by the way, was 6 times the Japanese government's revenue at the time. That's a heck of a lot of money. Now, what's really bizarre about this, after all this was completed, Japan went right in and took Korea anyway. So they completely ignored this agreement. This is also a change. I told you Puyi would come back. Here he is. Little Emperor Puyi, our child emperor, is now put in charge of China because Sun Yat-sen got defeated. Okay, so they put him in charge. The reason this is important is because this is the beginning of Japan becoming a world power. We see them on the top of the stage. Okay, if you look at this painting down here, this shows the Japanese meeting with the Chinese over here for the negotiation, and it's actually inaccurate because it shows Deng, the leader of China, in this painting, and he actually committed suicide after the defeat, so he was not there on that day. Our 7th event is the War of Liberation, otherwise known as the Chinese Civil War. It started in 1927 and went through 1936, and then World War II broke out. So they stopped and said, we won't kill each other for a while. Let's kill our enemy together. And how dumb is this? They went back to killing each other after World War II was over. I just think that's so crazy. So here are our two sides. We have the Republic of China, otherwise known as the KMT, or the Kuomintang government, versus the Communist Party, or the People's Liberation Army, the PLA. Okay? The leader of the Republic of China is Chiang Kai-shek. The leader of the Communists is Mao Zedong. And it's spelled sometimes like this with Z-E-D, and sometimes it's spelled like that. Remember, they write in symbols and sounds. Sometimes we change the look of it by how it sounds. So what happened? The U.S. spent tons of money supporting our allies over here because this is now after World War II, right? And we're in the Cold War, and we hate communists, right? So we want to make sure the communists don't take charge of China. It didn't work. It didn't work. So the communists take over. China becomes the People's Republic of China, and it becomes communist. What happens to Chiang Kai-shek and his people? They escape, and they go off onto the island of Taiwan that we saw over here, and they make their own little country. This is why Taiwan looks Chinese, because it is, but their government is more similar to ours. because they were a republic instead of a communist government. Okay? It's because of this failure that we're going to start sending soldiers instead of money with communism. So we're going to go into Vietnam, we're going to go into Korea, and then when that doesn't work, we send in assassins to kill leaders. It's kind of the steps that we took. 8 million casualties, by the way, in this civil war. Number 8, I will never forget, 1989, the Tiananmen Square incident. They call it the June 4th incident because they obviously don't appreciate that this happened. But to the rest of the world, we were pretty impressed. The government in China at this time was very dictatorial. They didn't have freedom of speech, freedom of the press, anything. And so college students in China stood up and they rebelled. And they said, we deserve our freedom. So they protested in Tiananmen Square. Well, the leader of China at the time ordered martial law. So all the military came in to take over the entire country. And I'll never forget this picture. This guy, this student, is standing in the middle of the street, and there are tanks coming towards him. And he's standing here holding up his hand. I'll never forget it.
Does he climb it?
What's that?
Doesn't he climb it?
He ends up getting shot. He gets killed. I remember thinking, I can't believe he was that brave. You got a tank coming at you and you're standing in the middle of the street, you know? Now, we really honestly don't know how many died. It sparked 400 rebellions throughout the whole country. But we don't know how many died because they won't let us know. We can't see the bodies. We believe it ranges anywhere from, I don't believe 0, but up to 2,600 died and up to 10,000 casualties. But we honestly don't know. All right, let's take a look at Japan. Our first event in Japan goes way back before the Renaissance, 1100s to the 1300s. But it helps you understand the samurai a little better, okay? This is the Kamakura government incident. So during the medieval era, the samurai basically took over the government because the government had no police force to enforce their laws. And the samurai were fighters, they were military. So they took over the government and the court. Well, just in time, because right about that time, the Mongols attacked, led by a guy named Kublai Khan. Do you recognize that name? Yeah. Some people know the name, they just don't know what it's attached to. Well, they first invaded China, right over here, and then they were headed to Japan. They were going to take over Japan as well. Well, luckily, they believed that the gods intervened. As they were coming across this bay over here, the Yellow Sea and the East China Sea, over to Japan, they were hit by kamikaze. But not the kind of kamikazes we know of in World War II. What are kamikazes in World War II? Yeah, Spencer? Suicide pilots. They would smash their planes into our ships, right? Okay? But kamikaze actually means divine wind. So what happened is they were crossing this sea, the winds would smash them into the rocks. More than once this happened. So they believed that the gods intentionally punished them and held them away. So they believed the gods protected them. And that's why they call those pilots kamikazes, because they were protecting their homeland from us. Yeah. So result, the Mongols were defeated and the samurai are brilliant warriors. At this point, the walls go up in Japan. Now remember, this isn't China. We're not talking about the Great Wall. We're talking figuratively. A wall goes up around Japan, okay? After the Kamakura, power shifted between different samurai families, and they were kind of fighting. It's kind of like the Italian families, like the Medicis and stuff, right? Finally, a really powerful military family called the Tokugawa family takes control in 1603. And Tokugawa Ieyasu becomes the leader, and he's given the title of shogun, which is the highest rank you can have in the samurai world. At that point, they started splitting up the country into 4 classes. You have your samurai, those are your professional soldiers. Then you have your farmers, these are the people that provide food so you can survive. You have your artisans, who are your creative souls. They do your music and your dance and your art and all that. And then you have your merchants, who are your business people. They also controlled the other families by putting them in prison so they wouldn't get out of hand. They banned Christianity in Japan, and they cut off Japan from the rest of the world for 200 years. Nobody got in, nobody got out. They didn't want to. They wanted to keep them within their borders. Until then, 1853. And again, like I said, leave it to an American, right? Commodore Matthew Perry shows up at Edo Bay, which is Tokyo Bay today, with 4 warships and a letter from President Fillmore. And in that letter, he addressed 2 issues. First of all, our Navy, sometimes the ships would crash and they would end up on Japanese islands. Well, our boys were being taken prisoner and they were being put in cages and put up in front of people. So the first thing he said is, you need to treat our soldiers better, our prisoners. Number 2, he asked to trade with Japan. Now notice I said asked. He didn't say I forced you to. He said I asked. Well, then Perry leaves, goes back to America. He comes back 6 months later for an answer to that letter, and he arrives with an entire fleet of warships with guns pointing at their heads and said, would you like to trade with us? So obviously they're going to say, yeah, yes, if they value their lives, right? So they signed the Treaty of Kanagawa, which said 3 things. First of all, we're going to open our ports to trade. Secondly, we're going to exchange prisoners. So we're going to get our boys back. Third, we're going to have a consulate or a base there in Japan. So that was the end of their isolation period. 1868 is our next event, number 4, the Meiji Restoration. And you know this one, so this should be a review. Emperor Mutsuhito, a young leader, probably teenage years to early 20s, about your age, was in charge. He called his reign the Meiji, meaning enlightened, because he was opening his mind to some new Western ways. And the samurai didn't like that, right? They wanted tradition, old school. They were led by Saigo Takamori, who you see right here. Ultimately, they wanted the emperor to make that stand and say, we need tradition, but he was not able to do that. His advisors were very strong-willed, plus they had the U.S. backing them with weapons and stuff. So in the end, you know what happened. What happened to the samurai? They all died, they were gotten rid of, and they changed to Western ways. Saw that in The Last Samurai. 1925 to 1945, we have the peace preservation laws. And this started in 25 and it went all the way through World War II. The leader, or the emperor of Japan, started passing laws that suppressed freedoms. So it was truly a dictatorship. No freedom of press, no freedom of speech. 70,000 people were arrested for those issues. Only 10% of them made it to trial. So a lot of them were just sitting in prison rotting. They didn't want to have to deal with them. A few of them were killed, and many were banished. So a lot of them went and lived in Korea, by the way. It wasn't until after World War II that Japan was defeated that changed. And then we repealed those laws. The picture you see there is General Douglas MacArthur, Dugout Doug from the Pacific in World War II, and Emperor Hirohito. After World War II, General MacArthur had to make a really tough decision. He had to decide what to do with the emperor, because to the Japanese people, he was a god, like really a god. But he also was the leader of a country that had attacked us. So do we put him to death for attacking us at Pearl Harbor and killing all our soldiers? Do we let him go? And they investigated, and they decided to let him live for 2 reasons. First of all, they knew if they killed this emperor, that whoever was left on Japan's mainland would probably do a huge last attack, and there would be massive riots everywhere. So that wouldn't be good. Secondly, Emperor Hirohito actually tried to surrender earlier, and his own military tried to assassinate him, which showed us that he was willing to end the war. It's just that the military was not listening. So they allowed him to live. Well, MacArthur wanted to negotiate this with the emperor himself. And remember that almost all the people of Japan had never even seen this guy. No pictures, never met him. So he was given certain rules. To meet the emperor, number 1, you can't look him in the eye. Number 2, you can't touch him. You have to wear gloves. Number 3, you can't walk in his shadow. Number 4, you can't take any pictures of him or have pictures with him. Within the first 2 minutes, MacArthur broke every single rule. He went, "Hi, General MacArthur, nice to meet you." Looked in the eye, shook his hand, touched him, stepped on his shadow, and took his picture in the first minute. So he ignored all those traditions. However, I will say he was pretty fair to him in the negotiations. He said, "Now, let's figure out how to put Japan back together." Because we just dropped 2 atomic bombs on their country. It was a mess. So he was fair when it came to that. But Mac was something else. Kind of liked to do things his own way. Speaking of bombs, this is probably one of the biggest watershed moments of Japanese history, and it affects who they are today. It affects their policies today. We dropped the first bomb on Hiroshima on August 6th of 1945. It was named Little Boy because it was smaller in diameter than the second bomb we used. 3 days later, we hadn't heard anything about surrender, so we dropped another bomb called Fat Man on Nagasaki. This is the beginning of atomic bombs. Sorry, my necklace is making noises here. And then 6 days later, the Japanese surrender, and we have VJ Day, Victory over Japan. A lot of interesting things going on here, okay? First of all, we didn't know what it would do to humans. We tested it in the desert, but we really didn't know what it would do. So, for example, on ground zero, this is what was left of humans. They were shadows of what used to be. There was no bone, there was no ash. They just disintegrated. They were gone. There was nothing left. At the ring outside of ground zero, you would see things like this. Whoops, excuse me, let me move that. Burns on the back of on the body. This lady here had her dress and her bag seared into her skin. Just horrible, horrible stuff. And the people that were outside that got behind a cement wall thought they were lucky. You know, I don't have any burns or anything like that. Well, 2 days later, they would start getting spots all over their body like you see here. And then he'd start feeling sick. So he'd go into the hospital, and pretty soon he couldn't swallow. It was like coughing up blood. It was like shards of glass in his throat, so he couldn't eat or drink. A few days later, he was spiking a fever, and he was talking in delirium, and then he would die because we didn't understand radiation and radiation poisoning. So a lot of people died that didn't think they were going to die at first. It affected over 200,000 people, and that doesn't even include the children that were born out of this generation too. So now there's a lot of questions about whether we should have dropped the second one. Some people say we should have dropped the first. I mean, you'll notice we have not used a huge weapon like that since World War II, right? Because we've looked at this and went, wow, this is a bad thing. We might have nukes, but we don't want to use them, right? Nobody really does, because we know how horrible it could be. It's nice to threaten, but boy, we don't want to use it. The guys that I've talked to from World War II would tell you it saved their lives, because we were going to invade mainland Japan, and the predictions were that it would have been 10 times worse than D-Day on Normandy. We would have lost so many guys because they didn't believe in surrendering. You know that about their culture, right? It would have been horrible. So it saved some lives. Definitely. The question is it worth saving our soldiers' lives to kill grandmas and children? If we had lost the war, we would have been put on trial for war crimes and found guilty, because the war rules say you don't attack civilians, right? We didn't target soldiers here. We targeted civilians. That's a question you have to answer in your own mind. I'm not going to give you that answer, you know, and everybody's maybe a little different.
What are the punishments for war crimes if you're found guilty?
You can be executed for it, actually.
So like our president could have been executed.
Yep. And probably would have been, actually. You know, a lot of people actually question, should we have used 2? Maybe 1 was enough. You know, I think about 9/11. We were in no way ready to announce some major thing in 3 days. We still hadn't even figured out who attacked us on 9/11. Our airlines were a wreck. People were freaking out all over. We were not ready to make any big decisions. So I almost wonder if we should have given them a couple more days, to decide to surrender. I don't know. Just something to think about. It was a really tough thing. And to most Japanese people, I went to school and college with a lot of Japanese students. They will tell you that their generation believes that the war in itself was a mistake. They made a mistake attacking the United States. They hate war, and they wish that they had never done it. And they never want to see it happen again, because the bomb was horrible. Right? Yeah, that's a good question. We haven't had time to really talk about that in this class. They don't usually let me talk about that world history. You get it in America next year, but because what was happening was Japan invaded China because they wanted oil, and obviously a little island like Japan doesn't have a lot of oil, and they also wanted land. They were crowded, tight, and I get that. We've done that ourselves, right? We've expanded. Well, China was our ally. So we said, you either get out of China or we're going to blockade you. And they wouldn't, so we blockaded Japan. And they knew that within a few months, they would completely be out of oil, which means no more planes, no more tanks, no more cars. They're basically out of everything. So they either had to get out of China or attack. And that's why they attacked. And they attacked at Pearl Harbor in particular, because that was where our naval fleet was based in the Pacific. And they hoped they would hit all of our aircraft carriers. The big floating cities that our airplanes took off of? That was the goal. Yeah. Because of big weapons like that? Yeah, that's definitely why we never got into a World War III in the Cold War, because neither of us really wanted to use those weapons. Because otherwise, you guys realize that in the Cold War, we had enough nuclear weapons to blow up the world 10 times over? How scary is that? If we hadn't had Kennedy and those guys staying calm, you and I wouldn't be sitting here today. Yeah. So it is kind of scary, isn't it? Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. So I want you to realize that this does affect us today. This is the atomic bomb dome. This is basically the only building that was left standing in Hiroshima after the bomb was dropped. And today it is a memorial for peace. There's a museum there. And because of this, Japanese people today are very anti-military, anti-war, and anti-bomb. They don't want anything to do with the military. After World War II, we passed the National Police Reserve Force, which basically said they couldn't have a military, but they could have a police force that protected their borders. And that was it. No Air Force, no Navy, just enough to protect their borders. Hang with me, guys. I want to tell you one more thing here. This is why this affects us today. Because the Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, is trying to create a military in Japan. And the people are freaking out. They don't like it. But he wants to have what he calls a collective self-defense, so that there's enough military that if we need our allies to help us out, they can send in soldiers. Or if North Korea sends a missile our way, they can blow it out of the sky. But that means they're getting into the military, right? And that scares the Japanese people because of what happened in World War II. Another thing that he did recently, last year, that made people really angry, as well as Mr. Justin Bieber, they visited this Yasukuni shrine. And I will tell you about that in just a moment. Okay, so what's happening is this Yasukuni shrine is the place where all of their veterans who have died are buried, basically. Their ashes are there. 2.5 million veterans are buried in this shrine, all the way from 1868 to 1945. Now think about how we would feel about that if our World War II vets were buried there, for example. That's a very honorable thing. Well, what happened in 1978, they also buried 14 war criminals from World War II. And these are the monsters of our world, like the guys that ate American POWs for dinner because they were starving, or beheaded people for no reason, or shot a bunch of people. And they were also put in the shrine. So ever since then, people have refused to visit the shrine because of the 14 bad guys that are in the shrine. Well, our prime minister said, you know what, this is ridiculous. Just because there are 14 bad guys in the shrine doesn't mean we shouldn't respect the other 2.5 million. So he went there, and then about a month later, Justin Bieber also did to make a stand. And they actually got, like protests, formal protests from our government, from the US, from China and Korea for doing that. So it was very controversial. So you're gonna wanna really kind of watch what's happening in Japan right now, because the people are not very happy with what's happening, but maybe it also needs to happen. I mean, look at your top 5 most powerful countries. How many of them do not have a military?
May11, please come to the office.